Hi, my name is Lance Hughes, and today I'll be talking to you about Azure Automation. I'm a systems engineer and have been working in the IT field for over 10 years. Most of that time has been spent working with small teams that have to move fast. The kind of teams where the terms jack of all trades and wears many hats are abundant. If you've been in the industry for a while, you know exactly what I mean. Being a part of these kinds of teams has been difficult at times, but it has given me the opportunity to understand how automation could significantly improve the lives and efficiency of these small teams. So if you are working with or managing one of these teams, or even if you just want to get started with automation, please stick around. By the end of this video, you'll have a better understanding of what Azure Automation actually is, what you can do with it, and how to set it up within your own environment. Let's get to it. So here we have all the sections we'll be going over throughout the video. It is quite a bit to cover, but I think if you stick with it, it'll definitely be worth it. So what is Azure Automation? Azure Automation is a collection of tools and services that enables centralized management and process automation. Think of it like a framework that allows you to orchestrate different pieces of automation within your organization or environment. So what do you need to get started with Azure Automation? Well, you really only need the first two things. You need an active Azure subscription and a basic understanding of PowerShell. When I actually first started out in Azure Automation, I knew a very small amount of PowerShell and learned as I was testing and went through the whole build process. If you want to do a bit more, you'll need an on-premise environment, Power Automate license, and a PowerApps license. However, all three of these are completely optional and will only build upon what you can already build within Azure with just the first two things. So what will I be covering in this video? We'll be setting up and getting started with Azure Automation. I'll show you how to use Azure Automation within any server in your environment. We'll talk about automation accounts, runbooks, automation in general, and these will be kind of fundamental items that I've found that have been necessary and required as I've been doing automation as a whole. We'll talk about the update, inventory, and change tracking features within Azure Automation, the different integrations for making the most of your automation solution, including PowerApps, Power Automate, and scheduling options. And throughout the course of the video, I'll be kind of talking about the idea of this employee onboarding scenario. This is where we need to create user accounts in a quick fashion to allow a better, more streamlined employee onboarding process. Here we see the architecture diagram of how our automation solution is going to process the flow of information from Azure throughout, even including our on-prem environment. Okay, now that we know a little bit more about Azure Automation and how it works, let's see what it takes to get started working with Azure Automation. We're going to need three core Azure components. We'll need a resource group that'll be used to organize and store all the necessary components within Azure. We'll need a log analytics workspace, which is the communication path between our runbooks and their workers, and this also adds some additional functionality to our automation solution. We'll obviously also need the automation account itself, and this is the primary component of the automation solution. This is where most, if not all, of your work will reside for your automation. Now we're going to go ahead and move through setting up the infrastructure for Azure Automation. We're going to create the resource group, create the log analytics workspace. We need to check the workspace mappings. There's actually a very specific connection between what region your log analytics workspace is in and what region your automation account is in. Most of them match up like for like, but I have noticed that on a number of different occasions, these mappings will need to be very specific. So please take a look at that before you move forward. so that you know that your connections will all work for you. Then we'll create the automation account once we know which workspace mapping we need. And finally, we'll be linking the automation account with the Log Analytics workspace using a short command within the Azure CLI. Okay? Now that we know exactly what we need to do to get started with Azure Automation, let's go in and actually run through the setup of that infrastructure that we just talked about. All right, so now we're in the Azure portal. We're going to go ahead and create our resource group. Now that the resource group is all up and running, we're going to create our Log Analytics workspace. The Log Analytics workspace is good. Now we're going to create our automation account. But before we do, let's go ahead and check that workspace mappings to ensure that we have the correct region mappings between our Log Analytics workspace and our automation account. Notice that mine is in East US for the Log Analytics workspace, so my automation account actually needs to be in East US too. You'll have to do this if you want to enable the change inventory update management pieces of the automation solution. All right, we're good to go. Now that we're done setting up the infrastructure, let's talk about all the different sections within the automation account themselves. We have the modules and credentials sections. The modules section stores the modules for your automation account that's available from within Azure directly. You can import these modules from your own computer or import them from the modules gallery. And then we have credentials. And the credentials section stores the credentials for the accounts that you may need to use throughout your automation implementations. For instance, you may be needing a service account from an on-prem environment or a service account in your Azure environment to ensure that your automations work correctly and you have a single account for that particular automation solution. Credentials is where you'll store that information and you'll be able to refer to those credentials securely from within your runbooks. Speaking of runbooks, let's take a look at what exactly they are. Runbooks are the code and workflows that make your automation solution do things. This is the actual code that you'll be writing for your solution to perform whatever action it is that you need your solution to perform. You can create your own, or there are also many different options within the Runbooks gallery that are already pre-made that you can edit and customize to meet your needs. We have multiple different types of runbooks. There are PowerShell runbooks, which is what we'll primarily be using, Python 2 runbooks, graphical runbooks, as well as workflow runbooks. Hybrid worker groups and watcher tasks. Hybrid worker groups are a logical grouping of your hybrid runbook workers, which are your physical or virtual machines that are connected to your automation solution. They can be Windows or Linux. They can run in any environment, and we'll cover them in further detail later. Right now, all you need to know is to have a hybrid runbook worker, all you have to do is install a lightweight agent and make a couple of configuration changes. And effectively, what you'll have is the ability to run your scripts on your servers wherever they may be from within the Azure portal or any of the integrations that we'll be talking about. We also have watcher tasks, which are runbooks that use event-based triggers. For example, when creating a new file within a folder, we want to manipulate that file and then move it. A watcher task could actually be triggered based on that file being created within that folder. Now that we have a better understanding of the automation account, some of the pieces and parts within it, and Runbooks, let's take a further look into Runbooks and see what they are and what we can do with them and how they differ from regular PowerShell scripts that you may see or you may run within your own environment. Here we have a simple runbook that I believe will give a good overview of some of the things that you can do with the Runbook scripts and how they differ. So for our parameters, we have multiple parameters. We have the ability to do an optional or a mandatory parameter, and we can set default values. We're forcing the Runbook to fail on error. That is a specific thing that I'm doing for the automation. I'll show you and I'll explain why that may be useful for you, especially as you're getting started. We're passing a credential asset to the Runbook. That credential is stored within our credentials section, and we're just calling that to pass it through securely. We're performing the Azure AD account lookup based on the input parameters, that user principal name that we're seeing. And we're writing the display name as an output for the job completion. So a pretty simple script, but it does show you a good idea of how you could do it and how you could manipulate it to ensure that it works for you or within your environment. Testing and error handling. For testing, you can use the test pane while in edit mode within the Azure portal. This will actually run the script, however, so please be careful. Live testing is after you publish. Once you publish, then of course you can go in, you can run your runbook as you regularly would and run through your testing scenario. For error handling, within Runbooks we can use our standard logic, our if-else blocks, our try-catch blocks, and so on. But you can also force your Runbooks to fail on error, and that will allow you to improve your Runbooks and ensure that they're not doing things that they really shouldn't. And you want to configure your logging and tracing options. These are within your Runbook properties. You can turn on or off the logging and tracing options. By default, they are off. So if you want some additional logging, your verbose logs and your additional logs there, go ahead and turn those on. Let's go ahead and take a look at that Get User Runbook and some of the error handling options that we have available to us from within Azure Automation. Alright, so here we are in the Azure portal. Before we jump into the Runbooks, I want to do a quick review of what we talked about within regards to the automation account so far. We have our modules. These are all the modules that are installed within our automation account. I've actually gone ahead and added the Azure AD module for the demos that we'll be completing throughout the rest of the video. We've talked about credentials. As you can see, I have two service accounts that have been added to the credentials section already. We talked about hybrid worker groups. I also have one group already set up with one worker, and we'll see that a little bit later on in the video. And we've talked about watcher tasks. I don't have any running right now, but there you go. Alright, so now let's take a look at that Get User Runbook. Everything is exactly the same. Now we're actually in the Azure portal and we're going to run it for real. So here I'm going to use a user principal name of an account that I know exists. We're not going to use any of the optional variables, and we're going to be running it on Azure. Let's kick it off and see what it gives us back. Alright, so we can see that the status was completed. We've got the input of the auto service at chaostechops.com. Take a look at our output. We've got no output, but we do have the output in the verbose log for the display name of the account and our default string value. Alright, so now that we know that that regular one works just fine, let's see what happens if we try to run it with an account that doesn't exist. Okay, so this status is also completed. We also have no output here. We have no errors, warnings, and in the output log, we have no value for the display name of the account, and we still have that default string value. but the status was completed even though it didn't find the account. So let's talk about how we can adjust our runbooks and what we need to do to ensure that we get the correct output or the correct status based on how we want the runbook to run. So we're going to go back to our runbooks, and we're going to take a look first at a runbook that has an actual code error within it. So here we have the exact same get user runbook that we talked about before, but here I've actually edited the script so that it does have an error within it and will never run correctly. So let's go ahead and run this one with that same known account on Azure. Okay, so this one also has a status of completed with the input of the known account, no output, but we do have one error. So even though we have an error here, and let's go ahead and take a look at the verbose logs, right? We did not get an account display name to output here, and we do have an error, but the status is still completed. So this is actually the reason why I've added in the runbook setting to fail on error, because I want to ensure that the status of completed actually means that the runbook ran correctly. So let's see how we could do that in practice. So remember, we want to error out when an account cannot be found, and also we want to ensure that the account, we also want to ensure that the runbook runs correctly. So here I've added a bit of logic. If the user account here is null, which would mean the account is not found within the system, then error out and throw this error with this message. So let's go ahead and run this with the account we know exists. All right, so that completed. We have no errors, and we did find the display name of that account. So everything still works just the same when we use an account that exists. Now let's see if our error handling and logic worked to error out for an account that does not exist. Alright, so we do see that the status of this one actually failed, and if we take a look at the logs, we can see that we've written a verbose outage saying that the user has not been found. So now the script does exactly what we want it to do. If you input an account that exists, it'll output the display name. If you input an account that does not exist, it will error out and let you know that the user has not found. Alright. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to a slightly more advanced runbook that will show off even more features and functionality that you can use within your runbook. We have a larger number of input parameters. We've added naming standard functions. We're calling another runbook for a generated password. We're creating an Azure password profile from the output of that other runbook. And we're creating a new Azure AD account based on the input parameters. Once all is said and done, we're writing the UPN and the password as an output to the logging for the job completion. And always remember, this kind of thing can be expanded to include the needs of your organization, no matter what that is. If you can do it within PowerShell, you can pretty much guarantee that you can also automate it. Let's hop in and take a look at that Azure AD Create User Runbook in action. All right, now we're back in the Azure portal, and we're going to go through the Create User Runbook. So as we can see here, it's the same runbook that I just showed you. Let's go ahead and kick it off and see what happens. Mr. John Smith is a project manager in North Carolina, and we're just going to give him a fake phone number here and a fake mobile number here. And we're going to be running this on Azure. Let's kick it off and see what happens. All right, we can see that the runbook has completed. Let's take a look at our logs. And it looks like we have an output of john.smith@chaostechops.com. And we have a password. All right, so now we see that the create user runbook did run. Looks like it ran correctly. Let's go ahead and hop into our Active Directory users and see if we see the account. Oh, and there we go. There is Mr. Smith. His account has been created. He is a project manager. We have his state, his office phone, and his mobile phone in here. So everything looks great. The only thing that we need to do now is make sure that the account can actually be logged into with the password that we were given here as an output. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the password. Hop into an Azure window. And see if we can log in as Mr. Smith. We're going to go ahead and paste in the password there. And we get the prompt to update our password since we've logged in for the first time. All right, so we've successfully created an account within Azure with our create user runbook, and we are able to log in to that account that we just created just like that. All right, so at this point, we've set up the automation environment, and we have a couple of runbooks that we can actually run within that environment. Here is the point where if you are 100% running in Azure, or if you only want to just get started with the basics, you can start creating your runbooks and running them right now. But our next step is to take this a little old school and move back to our on-prem servers and our on-prem Active Directory environment and take a look at how we can integrate Azure Automation with our on-prem environment using hybrid runbook workers. First, we have to set up our workers. This is where we're going to be going through the process of actually getting our on-prem machines, our virtual machines, our physical machines, wherever they may be, and integrating them within our automation solution. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to add the automation solution to our log analytics workspace using the Azure CLI. Now this is a slightly different command than the one that we used before, and it will give us different additional things that will be specifically used for our hybrid runbook workers. Then we'll be downloading the Log Analytics agent from the Quick Start menu within the Log Analytics workspace. And we will need our workspace ID and either our primary or secondary key from that Log Analytics workspace. Next, we'll be copying the installer over to the actual server that we would like to install it on. Run the installer, selecting the box to connect the agent to the Azure Log Analytics OMS, pasting in our workspace ID and key from before, and we're finishing up the installation wizard. Once it's done, we'll actually be able to see it within the control panel. Now we have the server itself talking to our automation solution, but it's not a hybrid runbook worker just yet. It's communicating, but it's not running anything. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to check the version of our automation folder in this path here. We want to navigate to the hybrid registration folder within that folder, and then we want to run the PowerShell module to import the hybrid registration PowerShell script. PowerShell module. And then we'll be adding the machine with the following PowerShell script. Now let's hop in and actually go through that process on one of our machines. Alright, so here I am remoted into one of the machines we're going to install as a hybrid runbook worker. I've already copied the scripts and the MMA Log Analytics OMS installer to this box so that I can set it up quickly and easily. Let's go ahead and run the setup wizard. Make sure we check the box to connect the agent to Azure Log Analytics. And here we're going to copy in our workspace ID and key. All right, now that we have those in place, let's go ahead and click Next. Leave all the defaults and let it install. Okay, now it's done installing. We can actually hop over into the control panel. And see that now we have the Microsoft Monitoring Agent showing within the control panel. So now the agent's installed and the machine will start reporting to our Log Analytics workspace. But the next thing we have to do is actually add it as a hybrid Runbook worker within our automation account. So let's open up PowerShell. I've already got the version folder for my hybrid registration. You'll have to find that in the instructions that we just talked about. I'm going to go ahead and change the directory here. All right, there we go. And let's import the hybrid registration module. All right, and let's run this very long PowerShell script to add this machine as a hybrid Runbook worker within our automation account. All right, now that that's complete, let's go ahead and hop into the Azure portal and take a look at our Runbook worker within our automation account. We're back in our automation account. Let's take a look at hybrid worker groups. And here we see that the domain controller -WG, that's our worker group for machines that run on domain controllers. We have 2 workers now as opposed to 1. And we can actually see the details of them. We have DC1 and DC2. We can see here we were on DC1. So now we have our on-prem server set up to run our Runbooks from Azure Automation. Okay, now that we're back from installing our hybrid Runbook workers, let's take a look at a simple Runbook that would be running on one of those workers. Here we have the same parameters that we saw before, multiple parameters, optional mandatory, default values. We're forcing the failure on error. We're not having to pass a credential because this is running locally. We're performing the AD account lookup based on the input parameters, and we're writing the display name as an output for the job completion. All in all, it's essentially the exact same script that we saw for the Azure-based Runbook, but running directly on an on-prem server within our own environment from our own Active Directory there. So now we're taking a look at an AD create user script, slightly more advanced Runbook. Here we have, again, a larger number of input parameters. We're adding the naming standard function. We're still able to call that other Runbook that is within Azure. We're creating the account password with the output from that Runbook. We're creating a new AD user account based on the input parameters, and we're writing the logon name and password as an output for the job completion. So as you can see, it's essentially exactly the same as the one that we can run in Azure, except for the fact that we're running it on-prem. So let's take a look at those Runbooks in action within our hybrid environment. Okay, so here we are back in the Azure portal, and we're going to run that create user on-prem Runbook. Going to have Jane Smith as a sales manager working out of California. Now, before we kick this off, let's make sure we look at the run settings because we are going to want to select the hybrid worker and our domain controller -WG worker group. Let's kick that off. Alright, so it looks like it completed successfully. Let's take a look at our logs, and here we do have the output for the username of jane.smith, and here we have the password. We're going to go ahead and take note of that password. Alright, so we've got the password stored. Let's go ahead and hop over to our on-prem environment and see if the account was actually created. So now we're in a Hyper-V environment and we're looking at one of our domain controllers. Here we can see that Jane Smith's account was successfully created. We've got all the information that we initially had put in. So now we know that our Runbook created the account. It is actually in our Active Directory environment, but we want to make sure that we can log into that account. So now I'm going to connect to a workstation that I have set up on our domain. I'm going to go ahead and switch the user. It looks like it's going to take our credentials. All right, and we're getting the Windows High. It's going to be setting up the account for the very first time. So we actually kicked off the Runbook from our Azure Automation. It ran on our on-prem server and created the account for us. Now that we've seen our Runbooks running on our on-prem environment, let's take a look at some of the things that we need to remember while running on the hybrid environment. We're using local resources and modules. So the machine that you're running your scripts on has to have the modules that you are calling or importing installed locally on it in order for it to run. Credentials can be passed as needed or set to default for the whole worker group. This means that in the configuration setting within the hybrid Runbook workers, you can actually say, use this credential that is stored in our credentials section to always run the runbooks for this worker group. It saves you a lot of time and effort if you have specific worker groups that are using the same service accounts or the same automation accounts over and over. Write scripts that are scalable and function on all the workers in your group. Because of the fact that we're using local resources and modules, if we have more than one worker in a group, both of the workers or all of the workers have to have all the modules to effectively be able to run your automation scripts. Test locally before moving to Azure. You have the box in front of you or you have it available to you to remote into. Hop in there, make sure the script runs locally first before testing and putting it in Azure. It'll save you a lot of time and headache. If you're trying to determine if there's an issue with a runbook in Azure before you've tested it on-prem, you may not know what's going on. Encode and schedule for outage windows and reboots. Remember, since these are running on our machines within our environment, they're also not going to give us the same 100 or 99.9% uptime that Azure does. So remember that when you're coding and make sure that you account for that. Now let's talk about some automation essentials. The what, how, and why of automation. What do we want to automate? We want to automate manual processes that are repeatable, those daily, weekly, and monthly items that are static in nature, and tasks that have a high chance of causing issues if not followed exactly. So how do we ensure a stable automation implementation? We have to make sure that we establish standards, have a deep knowledge of the process that's being automated. We'll need to make sure we test, implement logging and alerts to ensure our automation solution is working the way that we want it to. And then we're going to test again. Testing is never as more important as it is within automation solutions because you'll never be able to fully understand or know what's going on if you set it and forget it. And why are we automating? Because iterative improvements to our processes are much easier and quicker to implement. Less wasted time and more innovation, and it'll improve the services for our internal and external teams. Once we have an automated solution for something that was previously a manual or arduous process, or both, we'll be able to take the implementation, compare it to where we were before with our manual process, and I guarantee you almost every single time you will see significant improvements in the efficiency and process as a whole. Now let's talk about some of the additional features and functionality that expand upon our Azure Automation solution and make it a real full-bore implementation from a front-end UI design experience all the way to the back end where the automation is actually running. We have PowerApps and PowerAutomate. What you need to know about these is that they are tools that seamlessly integrate with Azure Automation to provide more robust options for triggering your runbooks. Additional licensing is required, but it will provide your junior team members and other business entities easy access to your automated process. As far as PowerApps, it's a platform for building custom web and mobile applications that integrates with your own data. It works together with PowerAutomate for the demo we'll be showing off, but it can also work separately. PowerAutomate, on the other hand, formerly known as Microsoft Flow, is a service that facilitates the creation of automated workflows. It works with many different triggers and connectors, and we'll be using this along with SharePoint list for our demo. Alright, now it's time to take a look at our PowerApps and PowerAutomate integration with our Azure Automation implementation. To really show off the potential options for integrating Azure Automation within your organization, I'll be running both these demos within Microsoft Teams. Think about how you could add these tabs in your own environment, giving your internal team access to perform these tested and automated processes themselves, or move the process off your team entirely, keeping control of the process, but making it much more efficient. Here we have a SharePoint list that I've created. All of these first columns match up with the inputs for our Create User Runbook, and these last two columns will be used to assist the process itself. The Account Type column tells the system if the account needs to be created in Azure or in our on-prem environment. And the Account Setup Status column lets us know where the account is in the process. Adding a new entry to this list now is the first step in our automated process. So let's go ahead and add an entry for a new employee that needs to be onboarded. Mike Smith is a developer working out of California. Test phone numbers, and it'll be created in Azure. Now that we have the entry submitted, let's take a look at what will be going on behind the scenes within our PowerAutomate flow. Here we are in the PowerAutomate portal, and we're looking at one of our onboarding flows. We can see here that this flow is triggered when a new entry is added to the onboarding SharePoint list. Next, we are creating a string variable for the account type and populating it with the choice value from the list. Depending on the account type chosen, the flow will either kick off our Azure Create User Runbook or our on-prem Create User Runbook. Both of these path configurations are basically identical, with only one real key difference. I don't want to go too far into detail about how to set up these flows in this video, but I do want to show you something that could help you when using the Azure Automation connector that Microsoft does not make very clear. When you're in an Azure Automation Create Job step like both of these, you'll notice this little Show Advanced Options link in the bottom left. Clicking this button will bring up an entry option for the Hybrid Automation Worker Group. This is where we need to enter the name of the hybrid worker group we want our flow job to be run on. By default, this option is not shown, and all jobs are run in Azure unless we specify it here. Keep that setting in mind when using PowerAutomate flows with your hybrid workers. So that is the only difference in these two paths. Here you can see that we are waiting for the job to complete before moving to the next step. Once the job completes, we are checking the status of the job and have two possible outcomes. If the job status is completed, we know that it ran successfully. So we'll be posting a bot message to our team's general chat about the successful run, and we'll be updating that account setup status column in our SharePoint list from requested to completed. If the job status is anything other than completed, we know that the job failed somewhere, and we'll only be posting a failure message in Teams so that we can investigate and resolve the issue before moving the status to completed. So now that we know what's going on behind the scenes, let's hop back over to Teams and see if we've gotten that message from our Flowbot. Awesome, so it looks like we've gotten a message from our Flowbot and the account has been created successfully. Let's take a look at Azure AD just to verify. And here we can see our newly created account in Azure AD. Perfect. Our process is working just as expected, and this type of implementation would be perfect for an internal team to process onboards. Now let's move over to our PowerApp tab. As you can see, the PowerApp has much more of a customer-facing design feel to it. This kind of integration would be great if you're building a solution for an external team, wanting to present more of a mobile app feel, or if you plan on expanding the scope of your integration. Since this is an app, you can add multiple pages and Power Automate flows to increase the functionality of the app itself. Since the Power Automate flows for both the SharePoint list and this Power App are essentially the same, let's go ahead and kick off an onboard request. This time we'll be creating an account in our on-prem environment with our hybrid workers. Martha Jones is an analyst out of Kentucky with some test phone numbers. It looks like we just received the message from our Flowbot, and the account creation was successful. Let's hop in to our on-prem AD and verify. Awesome, so the onboard from our Power App to our on-prem AD worked exactly as intended, and we can see the new account right here. So as you can see, both of our SharePoint list and Power App integrations work great, but each has their own look and feel and could be used in different scenarios. While the SharePoint list is a more economical solution that doesn't require additional licensing, it also doesn't give you quite the same extensibility as the Power App. If you plan to keep your Runbooks small and internal to your own team, the Azure portal and SharePoint trigger options should be enough for you. But if you're planning on passing the front-end triggers off to another team, or if you want a single application for all of your Runbooks, definitely take a look at the Power App options, because this may be a better solution for you, even though additional licensing is required. For inventory, change tracking, and update management. These three items are mainly circulated around managing the servers that run within our environment as our hybrid Runbook workers. What do you need to know? These are a set of features that can be enabled on machines reporting to the automation account. They cannot be run on the same machines as regular Runbook workers. This is a key thing to know because essentially you can either have custom Runbook workers or these system Runbook workers that include the inventory, change tracking, and update management features. You cannot do both at one time. Inventory gathers information about the software, files, keys, and services. Change tracking captures and reports on changes to specified files, keys, or services. And update management is a centralized Windows update management for your hybrid Runbook workers. You can have scheduled and targeted update install options. Think of this as automated WSUS implementation for your hybrid Runbook workers. Finally, we have schedules and additional ideas. Scheduling Runbooks. allows your runbooks to be run on a regular schedule. For example, you want to move accounts from an onboarding OU to a departmental OU every night. You can create the runbook and set it on a schedule to run at whatever time you need it to. To expand upon the onboarding scenario, we could check for duplicate accounts before an onboard is processed. We could add the account to groups based on the input, department, and title. We could set up an access request process, creating runbooks to update access to groups, folders, shared mailboxes as requested. Even with approval flows, if we decided to integrate with SharePoint and PowerAutomate. We could create an offboarding process, essentially reversing everything we did in onboarding, disable the account, convert it, move it, whatever we need to do within our automated process. We could integrate with a database for an employee lifecycle management. Now that we know when and where employees are coming on board, we know when they're going off board, we could easily integrate the automation solution with that database. And then anything else you can think of that may be needed in your organization. Now that you have a foundation level understanding, you can take that, see what other things that you can tack on top of that and make it a real full-fledged automation solution for your organization. We've covered a lot of content in this video. I hope you've enjoyed watching and following along. We now have a better understanding of Azure Automation and how to use it within different types of environments. We've talked about the automation account contents, integrations with PowerApps and PowerAutomate, and have created a few runbooks. All of the scripts, runbooks, and slides are available for you to download on GitHub. Feel free to use them as a stepping off point and think about where you could use this type of solution in your environment. Take a look at your top help desk tickets or call drivers, analyze those trends, and see if they would be a good fit for automation. Implementing automated solutions will not only free up your time, but will also improve the efficiency of the services you provide to your customers and employees. And Azure Automation is a great place to get started. Thank you very much for watching. Take care.